how to convert completely depleted row crop land into productive grazing land using cattle, cover crops, hay, and no chemicals. I'm talking with Ethan P. at Black Swamp Cattle on how he did this with his 25 acres. If you want to skip ahead to any specific topics, I have them time-stamped below. This video is brought to you by Shepherdess.com, where I provide you with supplies and resources you need to get off the ground as a beginner sheep farmer. I also have resources for beginners raising beef cattle, including one I'm going to link directly below. It's an absolutely free guide, the beginner's guide to raising grass-fed beef. Thank you all so much for being here. Please warm up the comment section by letting us know who you are, where you are, and what you are growing right now. So first question of the night is for you, Ethan. Do you have a farming background?
Yeah, I started helping my grandpa when I was about 8 years old, when he was doing a lot of row crop, helping my dad and my grandpa and uncles. And then when I was 13, I started doing a lot of the actual work for the running tractors and hauling grain carts. And as I got older and older, just got more and more responsibility with what we were doing on the farm for growing soybeans mostly.
And how many acres are you currently working with right now?
Right now, we are working on 25 acres.
And what took you from working with corn and soybeans to I want to graze animals? That's a 180.
Yeah, so I started helping my grandpa a lot, and then he got in a bad car accident, and so he wasn't able to do much of the farm work. And then I kind of was the one who started taking things over. And the 1 year when I was taking things over, I looked at the books and we lost $140 an acre that year. And so I decided that I need to look at how we can do things a little bit differently. And I was doing a lot of research, watching a lot of different videos online. And I've always really liked cows, going to the county fair and everything. I've always loved them. And then all of a sudden one night there was a Justin Rhodes video that just popped up on my YouTube, and it was about Greg Judy and how he had these cattle and 1,600 acres with no equipment and no machinery. And, you know, growing up in conventional ag, I didn't think that was possible. So then I was like, well, let's see what these guys are doing. And then once I saw what they were doing, everything he said only made sense. Right. And then I was like, this is what we need to do.
So I'm going to flip up some videos here of Ethan's operation just to give you guys an idea of what he's doing and what he has accomplished here on his 25 acres with grazing animals. I'm going to run first a look at from the top down. And Ethan, I'm seeing here, this is not a pond in the background here. What is that?
That is just a field, and that's just really, really bad water infiltration.
And this is afterwards. After how much time is what we're seeing on the right side of the screen?
Yeah, so that's about 3 years, 2 years of grazing, 1 year of cover cropping before the grazing.
And in cover cropping, what do you sow as a cover crop?
So we do a lot of different things, but we don't do anything in monoculture. We've used green cover seed, their smart mix calculator. It's a really fun tool if you guys ever want to try and just make a mix just to see what kind of species you can throw in there and what they'll do. The biggest thing that we tried to focus on is getting carbon back on the ground. That's your number one thing with row crop, is it's really depleted with carbon. I mean, in that picture you can see a lot of bare ground. And the best way to keep your soil microbiology going is to keep that ground covered. And so if you were doing something right at the very beginning and it was in the fall after a harvest or something like that, and maybe you couldn't afford to mix things together or didn't want to deal with it, then like cereal rye, so it's got a lot of carbon that it can put down if you let it get mature. And so that's something that we usually have as a cornerstone species in the fall. And then when we do interseeding in the summertime, sorghum Sudan grass is another like cornerstone species that we use because the cattle love it and it makes a ton of forage and it's really palatable. And so we like to kind of have a cornerstone and then build up around that to try and fill in the gaps with different species of plants.
So your cornerstones, you're saying, are the sorghum Sudan and the cereal rye. Was there anything else that I missed there? As a cover crop?
Those are the two that we really focus on mostly for us because of their growth and because with the sorghum Sudan, it's really palatable.
Mm-hmm.
And cereal rye is very, very prolific. It's not the best forage for cattle, but it'll grow anywhere on most any conditions. We've had it literally sprout in a metal box when we left it in our cedar before. And so if you've got really poor fertility, it's a great species to try and bring into your field.
I'm gonna read some of the comments here. Dave says, apologies for my tardiness. Dave, better late than never. Never apologize for coming in late. Rhonda asks, did you just throw out the seed, or did you need a drill or machinery to do this?
Okay, well, it depends on what your resources are and things like that, but we do drill quite a bit. We have an old row crop drill that we use in the fall. Like when it's like this, there's not a lot of litter. You're not really planting into a whole lot. When we're doing an interseeding into pasture, then we rent the local NRCS no-till drill. But if you don't have a tractor and you don't have the ability to do anything, I mean, you can ask your neighbor, see if they can help you. If not, then you can broadcast. You just have to be aware of the type of species that you're broadcasting. Really big seeds, they don't like being just broadcast on the top of the surface, unless it's something like cereal rye. Seed isn't huge, but it's just so prolific that it'll pretty much grow anywhere.
Right.
But yeah, drilling is best if you can do it. If you can't, then using animal impact and broadcasting and feeding hay on those areas that you broadcast, they're all really good ways of kind of incorporating the seed.
Tamlin asks, what cornerstone crops and, okay, yes, Tamlin, it was sorghum and cereal rye.
Sorghum Sudan.
Sorghum
grass.
Sudan. Now, is that distinct from the sorghum variety?
Yeah, they're things. Sorghum makes a lot more grain, and you can run into issues with acidosis with the grain in your cattle. And then there's also what's called prussic acid. So if you get into drought or frost and you have that sorghum, your risk of prussic acid poisoning is much higher.
James asks, where did you say that you purchase your seed from?
Yeah, if you go to Green Cover Seed, the seed calculator is Smart Mix. It's on their page, or you can type in Smart Mix seed calculator and it'll come up.
Perfect.
And then I'll just explain that a little bit. They ask you a handful of different questions, but there's three big ones that are really important, and that's your resource concern. And so what that means is, what are the number one things that you're worried about in your field? And if you have something that has been row cropped and you're going to graze it, then obviously supplemental grazing or grazing with regrowth. But supplemental grazing, I would recommend, especially if you're doing your first year. Organic matter, and then mycorrhizal fungi growth. Those are your three that you kind of want to focus on. But of course, everybody's different, just depending on what kind of operation you're coming into. But those are kind of the big three that I would suggest starting with on row crop ground.
So list those big three again one more time for me.
Yeah, so supplemental grazing, if you're going to graze it, increase organic matter. I don't know if that's the exact wording that they use, but organic matter. And then the third one is mycorrhizal fungi growth.
Okay.
Those are the three that you really want to focus on.
Okay. Bert asks, can you grow the cereal rye in a partially cleared area that has a few big trees?
Yeah, you can do that. And if it's kind of bare, then you can just broadcast it. It's probably not going to be the same kind of growth as what you would have in an open field, but it will grow for sure. If you're getting sunlight down onto the actual ground, then yes, it'll grow.
And then the arsenic poisoning, Bert asks what you said about the arsenic poisoning in relation to the sorghum versus sorghum Sudan.
Yeah, so with sorghum, the risk is a lot higher because it has a buildup of prussic acid. So if you plant it and then you come into drought, basically if the plant gets stressed, then it's going to build up that prussic acid, which then basically gives you arsenic in the blood of your animals. So that's the risk with the sorghum. It's cheaper, but I would say it's much worth it to spend the money on a sorghum Sudan hybrid because you don't have as much of that grain for acidosis, and then you significantly lower the prussic acid. So drought and frost, those are the two things that kind of cause that buildup. If you do get a frost, then you just wait until the plant isn't green anymore, and then you'll reduce that risk of prussic acid.
That's really good advice. We have a lot of that growing in Upper East Texas here, so that pops up a lot on people's pastures. Any advice for Daryl, who has bees in East Texas, field of wildflowers? Do you have any experience or advice for Daryl?
Actually, yeah, they have pollinator mixes, perennial pollinator mixes as well. And then if you just want to do a easy, quick thing that'll make a ton of flowers, is buckwheat. Buckwheat puts on a ton of flowers, and it's a very cheap seed. It's pretty prolific as well. It's a warm season. It does really, really well.
All right, I'm going to run this underground view of what they've got going on at Black Swamp Cattle. Guys, if you are new in the room, we have Ethon at Black Swamp Cattle. He is running cattle on his family's previously row cropped land. I'm going to give you a look at what the soil subsurface, the improvement there. All right, so tell me, when was this particular picture taken here?
So that was taken in September of 2020.
Okay.
And then this next picture was taken in the exact same spot in September of 2022.
Wow, so that's 2 years.
All
right, so we talked about the cover cropping, but aside from cover cropping, what other means of increasing soil organic matter have you put in place on your farm to achieve these results in 2 years?
Yeah, adaptive grazing is really, really big. Moving the animals every day, and it makes a difference. It really does. I actually just took a picture today for some orchard grass and some fescue, and you can see a definitive line where the cattle grazed it, and in one day there's about a 1/4 inch of regrowth.
Wow.
So then if you left them in there, then they're going to knock that plant back and eat that regrowth. So that makes a really big difference, moving them every day. It really does. And then the other thing we do during the dormant season and or when we run out of grass is we feed hay on pasture. And that has been really, really big for adding fertility.
So a question for you there would be, did you decide what quantity of cows you wanted to carry, and then you decided to feed to supplement what your land wouldn't provide, or did you decide to go minimal and build as your land's carrying capacity went up?
Yeah, we decided to go with the minimum that we could to start, knowing already that what we were going to be able to grow on the ground was not going to be enough to feed them. And that was with 1 cow-calf pair and 1 bull. And on about 10 acres initially, we couldn't feed them for the year.
1 cow-calf pair and a bull on 10 acres.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking at here is the before pictures.
Yep. Yeah, so we've been growing slowly since then. I've purchased 1 cow-calf, an additional cow-calf pair, and then we had 2 heifer calves this year, so we're retaining those hopefully. And so upping our actual production on our properties and then adding rental properties as well, because people see what we're doing and they like it.
Right. Now, in moving every day, how do you amend for the shade issue? Do your animals, are they sensitive to shade, to a need for shade, or can they basically go without it for a day?
They can go without a day, but we have a mobile shade structure, just like, looks exactly like what Joel has. We just have it a little bit smaller since our paddocks are smaller. And that's actually, I forgot that. That's actually a really good way that we build fertility as well.
Yes, right.
When we have a really weedy spot, a lot of ragweed or something like that, a lot of cottonwoods, we park that shade structure on there, and then they spend a lot of lounging time there. And so it knocks back those bad species, or not bad, but non-desirables, and adds a lot of fertility there as well. So when it gets real hot and humid, animals don't need shade, but it really does help them quite a bit. And so having a mobile shade structure, I think, is a really good way of helping them out there.
Daniel says, what do you do for fungus growth?
Yeah, so there's certain plants that are mycorrhizal fungi hosts. oh man, I'm blanking on the one that's really flax. Flax is really good for mycorrhizal fungi growth. Mycorrhizal fungi loves flax. It doesn't have a lot of feed value, but that fungi growth makes up for paying for the seed. The other thing you can do is inoculate the seed that you're buying. That is an added expense. So you have to kind of weigh those things on how much money do you want to spend and how much time do you want to allow to kind of do that building. And that's what we've tried to balance with spending enough money to move things along quickly, but also trying to not break the bank and use some of our time resources as well.
This is a question for the audience, guys. Are you building soil fertility on your land? And what is one of the most effective methods you have used for building that soil fertility? Daniel asks, what is the average seed cost per acre?
That's a good question. And like most things, it depends. It depends on how much diversity you have in the mix. Depends what kind of species. Grazable species are usually more expensive than species that put on grain. And that's because it's a lot easier to harvest the seed if it's made to put on grain. But then it's a lot lower quality for grazing. So it's a balance. Depending on what you plant, you're looking at $30 to as much as $60 an acre. And then if you start adding on a lot of inoculations like that mycorrhizal fungi inoculant, you can get up into the $70 range. So yeah, it just depends on how much diversity you want to have in the actual mix.
I think somebody asked up the line about trample planting versus drilling. Am I right that usually they have a different rate for each method of planting the seed?
Yep. Yeah, it's going to take more seed when it's broadcast and trampled, just because you're going to have less seed to soil contact. And that's really the key to make sure that those plants establish. So you have to up your odds. And so it takes more seed. When you're drilling, then you're doing a lot more of a direct putting that right into the ground. And then if you're using a planter, then it's even lower, but not many people want to loan out their planters. That's for sure.
Right. All right. Rhonda, is spreading seed mix good for late fall, or is it just meant for early spring? What can we do over the next 2 months specifically?
Yeah, it depends where you are, because it depends on your frost date. That's one thing that's really key. But in the fall, you want to focus on cool season plants. As we're getting a lot closer to fall, lower day length, you really want to focus on your cereals. Rye and triticale is another good one. If you are taking land that was row cropped and you're trying to make it grazable, I advise against planting perennials, especially the first year, because you're going to see a lot of failure with those plants.
Let's touch on that a little bit deeper, because people are going to push perennial. But you're saying as a startup, you probably need to back off just maybe a season or two.
Yes, 100%. And the reason being, row crop fields are really bacteria dominant because of tillage and spraying and fungicides and things like that. So perennials need a much higher bacteria to fungal ratio. So the best way to do that is growing annuals, because annuals do it much better in a bacteria dominated environment. That's why you see all those weeds. Those weeds are all annuals or biannuals. Use what nature provides and plant your annuals your first year to start up in your organic matter. 1 year, I would say do all annuals. And then maybe on year 2, if you see some improvement, you see a little bit of life coming back into your soil, then I would still put some annuals in a mix and then possibly add some cheap perennials, things like red clover, because also red clover seed doesn't ever really go bad. When you put it in the ground, it kind of is always good. For grass, it depends on where you're at, but I wouldn't put a lot of focus on planting perennials. A much better way of bringing perennials in is through the use of feeding hay on that land.
That's really good advice. And the reason that the annuals improve organic matter in the soil is because that root system basically gets left behind, if I'm right.
Yeah, and they put on a lot more growth all at once. They grow bigger faster for 1 year because it's all based off of that seed. So they want to get as big as they can, and then put on as much seed as they can. And then the key is grazing them before they get to put on seed. And if you want to stockpile something for winter time, they have what's called photosensitive plants, which delays when it puts on seed. Yeah, there's a whole lot of different ways that you can go about it. You can do things like planting warm seasons in the spring to make up for your summer slump, and then you could graze those. And then after you've grazed through those warm seasons, you bring them back onto pasture as things start to cool off. And then you can plant your cool seasons, like those cereal rye, triticale, vetches, things like that.
All right, we had a question. Do you have any experience with Phacelia? I think that's the way it's pronounced there.
Yes. Yeah, that's how you pronounce it. Yeah, it's a blooming species. It doesn't have a lot of value for grazing, but if you want to attract pollinators, it's a really, really good plant for that. But it is pretty thorny. If you did put it in a mix, I would not put a lot in, just because it kind of looks a lot like thistle, and it's kind of going to do the same thing that thistle does. Kind of puts on a lot of thorns, and you can force animals to eat it, but yeah, it's not really meant for that, I should say.
So Bert asks, is adaptive grazing defined as moving them daily?
No. Adaptive grazing is, I'm trying to think of the best way to define it. I can tell you what it's not. Right. And that is, it's not prescriptive. So if prescriptive grazing would be saying, I'm going to move them every day, and it's going to be this size of a paddock, and that's how I'm going to move them. Adaptive grazing is being able to adapt to the circumstances that are in front of you. If you end up getting a big flush of rain and you're having a lot of growth, you're going to need to spread your animals out and move them over the land faster, because you're going to have a better recovery rate. If you're going through drought, you need to hunker your animals down, put them in tighter, buy yourself time on your rotations. If you have an area that has a lot of woody overgrowth, then you're going to need to graze that differently. And so adaptive grazing is really based off of observation and being able to observe what's going on in your pasture, and then addressing how you're going to graze it based off of what you're observing.
That's good information. Desiree, if you're moving your cattle every day, how long of a break do your paddocks get between grazings?
Depends on the time of year. In the spring, when things are really growing really well, 30 days. In the summer, especially when the water spigot turns off, then you're looking at 70, 80, where we are. And again, if you're in an area that's a lot more arid, like where we are, we average about 34 inches of rainfall a year. Okay. So it depends on what your conditions are, but the best thing you can do is watch the recovery of your grass that you've grazed. If you've never done adaptive grazing before, a really good thing to do is start off by giving them an area that you know is going to feed your animals. Have them there, put in a stick in the ground, put a piece of tape or a mark or whatever, and then watch to see when it grows. And then when you see that plant is recovered, then you know, all right, I should be moving back to that area. And if it looks like it's not recovering, then slow down, because you know you're going to need a lot more time before that plant has fully recovered.
Oh, that's a good practical advice. Bert says this green cover site is awesome. Thanks. Green cover is our plug of the night. It's not sponsored, guys, but it is just such a great resource. We're telling you, go get your cover crops there, and tell them that the Shepherdess and Black Swamp Cattle sent you, and maybe they'll give us a coupon someday. All right.
Yeah, there you go. One quick thing on that smart mix. You guys, if you use it, and they openly say this on Green Cover, you don't have to buy seed from them. They don't care. They just want people to use more cover crops. So if you can buy seed from them, they're going to appreciate that. But if you live on the other side of the country and it's going to cost you a couple $100 to have it shipped, and you can do something somewhere closer, use the calculator, come up with a mix, and see if you can get a supplier closer to you. And they're more than happy to share that calculator with everyone.
That's good. Galen says that Albert Lee Seeds, Lacrosse Seeds, and Byron Seeds are also some very good companies. Tim says, I have been building fertility as my soil is some of the lowest in organic matter in the county. I have been seeing the biggest improvements with grass and grazing pigs. Wow. Importing all of the feeds and supplementing the pigs on a diet of grass and legumes makes an enormous impact. I'm going to go on to this next slide. And a question for you, Ethon, would be, what did you actually do a soil test to monitor the increase in organic matter, or are you just going by sight?
So we did do a baseline. In 2020, we took a baseline soil sample test for organic matter, fertility, biology, and we haven't done one yet. I was planning on next year, kind of doing every 3 years or so. And yeah, but other than that, kind of your day to day, we use observation of the soil, digging a hole, seeing what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah,
this
and you can see things are pretty rough.
This is before here, and it actually appears as though the ground was tilled up. Is this just directly after something was harvested off of that row crop land?
Yeah. So that was actually no-tilled that year.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks that poor because of that sand. Those sand hills just do not produce very well. They really low fertility. They don't hold water.
Mm-hmm.
That's been kind of the biggest struggle that we've had is trying to keep those sand hills producing.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they were tilled for 100 years before that. But yeah, that specific year they were not.
That is interesting. And so what we see here, is this a hay cover for feed or just for ground cover, or both?
That particular one on the left was just for ground cover. That was before we had cattle.
Okay.
We were just putting something down just to try and get something to cover the soil. That was the number one thing. And that was the cheapest hay we could find. And it was in small square bales. And I would go out every night and load up a wagon and cut those small square bales and just spread it by hand.
Wow.
Every single night. And just kind of get out all that organic matter that we could.
Have you applied any fertilizer just beyond the hay bales that you're unrolling?
Nope. Since we've started grazing, use no fertilizer, no chemicals of any kind, no herbicides, no fungicides, no pesticides, nothing like that. When we were doing conventional row crop, we did, but after we converted, we did not.
Okay.
Or do not.
Matthew May says the best thing he can recommend is intensive rotational grazing. You will notice quick improvement on your land with this. Connor says our farm was in row crops over 10 years ago. With careful management, planning, as well as planned rotational grazing of cattle, hogs, and poultry, the fertility has been brought way up. Tim says, I totally agree with starting with annuals first and then moving to perennials. And that's an important thing to hold on to, guys, because you're going to hear a lot of the established graziers. I think Joel Salatin pushes perennials. You're going to hear perennials a lot, but I think that's a really good bit of advice. If you're starting with something that is so depleted as what we're looking at here, go with annuals first to get some of that organic matter back into the soil. Daniel says, have you ever run into issues with bloat in respect to clover?
No, I would put that with a caveat, because if you take animals that were on a really poor low protein diet, or if you have a field that's over 60% clover, I would be very, very cautious with that. But you can acclimate animals to that high of clover. And then the other thing is, don't move them into an area that's clover dominated early in the morning when it's dewy and things like that. That puts you at much higher risk of bloat. And then also, if you move later in the day, you're going to have higher sugar content in your plants anyway. So it's better to move after noon. But yeah, acclimate. If you have animals that are coming from just grass or off of really rough forage, then give them a little section of that clover. And then the next day, give them a little bit more, and then just kind of wean them into it. But if they're on it pretty regularly, as long as you're not over 60%, we don't worry about it. We haven't had any kind of issue.
That's good. Judah says, I have not done anything with fertility of the soil specifically. It was an old horse pasture 8 to 10 years ago. Other than running chickens over it for the last 4 years, I haven't planted or added any fertilizer. I've been very impressed with the change of quality. It was mostly sand and very little grass production, and now it is so thick you will trip if you are not careful. All right, so I get this question a lot, and I'm going to ask this question of you. What breeds of cattle do you favor for your operation? I guess what are you running and what do you favor? Those are going to be two questions there.
So for cows, we have what we could afford and what we could get. We have Beefmaster Angus, Gelbvieh Angus, but I like South Poles, and not to jump on the South Pole bandwagon. I know it's a hot thing right now, but our bull is South Pole, and man, even he just outperforms them by a lot. And he's more moderately framed than the cows that we have, and the cows are going to be more moderately framed. Well, usually, just because something's a South Pole doesn't mean that it's a good cow. That's another thing.
Right.
South Poles tend to be more moderately framed and tend to have bigger guts and things like that, but you still need to pay attention to the specific animal that you're buying. And if you live in, North Dakota, don't buy a South Pole. It's going to be rough on them.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asks, what is a way? Any good hay unroller ideas?
Yeah, somebody just said Greg Judy sells some. He does. We made one because we didn't have a lot of money. So we had an old vegetable cultivator, row cultivator, and we took all of the shoes off of it, and then we took some angle iron and 2 pieces of metal dowel rod, and then we put them through a pipe, and then that way we put some chains on the end of it so then it doesn't fall out. We can push it in the sides, lift it up on a tractor on a 3-point hitch on the back of a tractor, because we have tractors from doing row crop. And so, yeah, we made one from parts laying around. But yeah, if you're moving around round bales, Greg Judy's is great because you don't need to have a tractor. You can have a 4-wheeler or anything like that. Yeah, if you can get away with not needing a big tractor, then I would recommend finding a way to not use a big tractor, because when you go out in the spring, or if it's a warm winter, then you're going to have a big rutted up mess, especially in row crop fields, because they don't have any root structure to hold you up. So that's something to be aware of.
That's a good point. A couple of other questions is, do we need to be concerned about Grazing and other herbicides when buying poor quality hay to spread?
Yeah, I mean, get to know your hay producer if you can. We struggle a lot around us. We have a lot of people producing hay for horses, so we kind of struggle with finding affordable hay. But any kind of chemical use is not great. So if you can find somebody that uses the minimum, go with them. That's the best advice I can give there. Get to know your hay producer.
It's tough with hay because they actually advertise it. The advertisement heavy fertilized hay is something that sells. I mean, people advertise that because that's supposedly the good quality hay. So it's very difficult. It's not something, when I'm buying hay, unfortunately, it's not something that I have even started shopping for, because I understand it's a bit difficult.
I will say for hay, if you find somebody, because if you have cow calf and you're not calving in February and you're calving in sync with nature, and when it's warm, or when the deer calf or fawn, you can get away with things like meadow hay, which is just people cutting whatever they can, and those type of folks usually don't put a lot of inputs on that land because it's just grass that they're trying to get rid of. So if you want to get something that's more affordable and maybe isn't necessarily organic, but probably doesn't have a lot of herbicides and things like that on it, meadow hay is a good option.
Okay, meadow hay. And I actually have been seeing a lot of that in particular. And again, it's advertised as the poor quality hay because it has not been sprayed for weeds. But keep an eye on that meadow hay. As far as hay for soil fertility, how many bales are you finding yourself feeding per head right about now? And has it improved over the last 2 years?
It has improved. Last year, we were feeding 10 bales per head. Now that was over about 6.5, 7 months, which is a very long time. And we were quote unquote, wasting a lot of it. We didn't make them clean everything up, and we depending on how we were doing it, if we were doing experimentation with bale grazing, which we got a lot of waste doing some experiments that way, but we always tried to leave residual with the hay.
Right.
So you're going to end up feeding more, but that's going to speed along your regeneration of the soil.
For the hay waste, what percentage would you say that you like seeing left behind?
Yeah. If you're unrolling it, then I want to see if there's snow, it's a lot easier to tell.
Mm-hmm.
But if you unroll it, then it just should look like a light film, like you can see the snow through it. And then, all right, I'm leaving a little bit. They probably trampled a lot of that, stepped on it. I don't want them eating it anyways because I don't want them getting sick. Move them on. If you're doing bale grazing, then put out a bale. One, it's got to be cold. It's got to be frozen, or it needs to be dry. And then only put out enough hay so that it's going to take them 2 days to clean it up, because otherwise they're going to lay in it and they're going to foul it up and they're not going to eat it. And you're going to have an 8-inch thick mat of hay where nothing's going to grow in the summertime. And you don't need to have round bales to bale graze. You can do that with one small square bale if you have only a handful of sheep or goats, and if it's an amount that they're going to be able to clean up in about 2 days or even a day, then just throwing out one bale right there, if that spot needs a lot of fertility, bam, it's a great way to really boost that one little spot.
That's a good mention, that you don't want to overdo it with the residual. You're saying you want to make sure you can see the ground a little bit through that, because it will become basically just a mat where nothing grows for years.
If you get over 2 inches, you're probably going to see a severe reduction in production in that area. It's going to be too much.
With this particular here, did you have any struggles with that issue, or was it just so in need of that ground cover that it?
Yeah, that needed everything there. And so, it's a little thick. When we were doing this on that bare ground, we just wanted to see no bare ground.
Right.
And we also knew we were going to be planting into that anyway. So we weren't too concerned there.
What I see on the right side, is this a result of planting seed as well, a cover crop?
That actually came up from hay. That's several different types of foxtail. That was some rougher hay that we had, and that's something that you're going to see when you bring in rougher hay. It's going to be, you're going to have some less desirable plants, but it's still forage. The cattle are still going to eat it. It's something growing. It's going to put down organic matter, and something growing is better than nothing growing. So even if it's ragweed, it's better than bare ground.
Right.
So.
All right, I'm gonna make sure I'm caught up. We are 3 minutes off, guys. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Galen says good quality hay is more based on how it was baled and stored, in her opinion. Dave says he is in the process of moving to Texas within the next month. What are the best feed suppliers in the area? Dave, check out Martindale's Feed. Martindale's Feed. It's a regional feed store here. William says, for unrolling my round bales, I push a bar through the center. If you hit the center right, it goes through with moderate difficulty. The rod has a hockey puck sized cap on one end and is shaped like a chisel on the other. I use my box blade and a chain to pull the blade and unroll it with my tractor. That's a good one.
Yep, we've done that.
Dave is coming from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Texas. He's going from 7 inches of rainfall to 47 inches, Dave. So you are probably should get your snorkel out if you're from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Tim, we have cheap cattle, but I'm improving the herd with a South Pole bull. I custom grazed cattle this year for the other South Pole cattle. Did so much better than the majority of the Angus and larger framed Herefords. Connor says, I have a couple of whoopsie spots where a thick mat of hay was left behind too quickly, and it's bare now. Yes.
If you plant something there, though, it'll be the best growth that you'll see in your whole pasture.
That's good. There's redemption.
So that's, yep.
Galen says
Band-Aid.
foxtail can be good feed. Greg asks, what poly wire or wire do you use for fencing?
So I'm a disciple of Greg Judy. So we use the PowerFlex, the braid from PowerFlex. It's really good stuff. I mean, we haven't had any issues with it. It doesn't break. It always has charge in it. And then for perimeter fencing, we just use electric. On our home property where there's somebody there all the time, we just have 3 wires of 12.5 gauge high tensile. And then on places where we're not there all the time, we like to use 5 just for peace of mind.
All right, so final question for you is, this land is your family's land. A lot of times people are saying to me, I wish I had family that trusted me to manage what's going on here. What was that situation like for you? Was it a difficult transition, or were they just sick of managing it?
No, it was pretty difficult to get started. Our family has always been kind of opposed to livestock production just because of what you see in conventional livestock. And so it was a lot of conversations, a lot of research, and then just kind of slowly, incrementally working towards that. And it is hard to do. Here's a hot tip. If you can find somebody that's part of the regenerative movement that kind of came from a similar background to whoever you're working with, that's a great way to kind of help somebody along the trail. Like for my family, Gabe Brown, because he was a row crop guy, he was able to kind of communicate things in a way that made it, easier and hit harder home for some folks. So that's a hot tip if you're trying to change folks' perspectives.
Yeah, and I want to encourage any young people watching or listening to this. Our enthusiasm and our energy is what our parents and our grandparents really need. There was someone at Stockman Grass Farmer last month. He is 27 years old, and he goes all on lease land with his sheep operation. And he says, as young people, we need to be willing to do what other people are not to get access to the land. So just work hard, show them that you're willing to put in the work. All right, thank you so much, Ethon. Tell people how they can get in touch with you and where they can buy your beef.
Yeah, so Instagram, we have Black Swamp Cattle. So we try to post, show what we're doing, do kind of info on little experiments that we run. And then we have a website, blackswampcattle.com. And I have an email, ethonp@blackswampcattle.com. And if you guys have any questions about production or converting any kind of row crop land or recommendations on seed mixes or anything, shoot me an email. More than happy to help. And yeah, that's the best ways to get a hold of me.
All right, perfect. Don't forget, it's Ethon with an O. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. If you're looking for something to watch next, tap this video where I grew 1,000 pounds of grass-fed beef as an absolute beginner.